All right, so picking up where we left off with critical thinking, the next thing we're talking about is self-interest studies. A question you always want to ask when you are reading a study is who sponsored the study. If it's a corporation or a special interest group, you might want to be wary of it. We're not saying that they would necessarily fabricate results, but they do have motivation to design and publicize studies that benefit them. All right, so the last two things we're going to talk about are in interpretation of results, not so much in sampling and design. The first one is basis for comparison. Before we talk about this example that's right here, let me mention another one that I think will make this seem a little easier. So suppose we found out that orchestra conductors lived to be 83 years old on average. Well, it might be tempting to look at that statistic and think that that really means something, to think it means that orchestra conductors tend to live a longer life, perhaps because of the creativity. But what we need to do is compare that to another group, like the general population. The general population who lives into adulthood. The general population of creative people. You name it, so that we can determine if there's something different about being a conductor that would lead one to have a longer life. So, with that in mind, here's an example that's a little bit more challenging. Suppose we found out, and I did hear this in a presentation that a fellow student gave one time when I was in a class. 68% of all victims of teen suicide come from a broken home. And if you just look at that number, that might give you the idea that coming from a broken home is perhaps a contributing factor to teen suicide. But elsewhere in this student's presentation, she said that 69% of all teens, almost exactly the same percent, don't live with both parents. So what does that mean? It means that if you look at victims of teen suicide and the general population, they're the same in terms of the frequency of coming from a broken home. So that makes it sound like actually coming from a broken home is not a factor at all. Okay, because the teen suicide victims have the same percentage of coming from a broken home as everybody else. So just looking at that standalone statistic can be misleading. The last thing that we're going to talk about is correlation versus causation. And we often say correlation does not imply causation. And what that means is the fact that two things occur at the same time does not necessarily mean a cause and effect relationship. So an example, I don't know if this is true, but suppose we found out that people who take medicine for having high cholesterol have higher rates of heart attack than everybody else. The conclusion that someone might reach would be that the medication for high cholesterol is what's causing the heart attacks. That's an erroneous conclusion, though, because the people who take medicine for the heart attacks are taking it because they have a high risk for heart attack by virtue of their high cholesterol. So you don't know that it's the medicine that's causing that or what caused them to take the medicine in the first place. So cause and effect cannot be determined from that example. So here's another example. I've read that couples who live together before they get married have a higher divorce rate than other people. And one conclusion might be an erroneous one, but people could conclude that living together causes couples to be more likely to divorce. Well, again, cause and effect can't be determined here. There's probably, in this case, a third factor, what's called a confounding factor, that is causing both of those things. It's probably attitudes and values that might lead couples to live together before marriage might also make them more likely to leave an unhappy marriage. If you think about who would not be willing to live together before they get married, sometimes those are the more religious people, and sometimes those would be the people who are less likely to get divorced. So again, you can't determine cause and effect from looking at this. And again, this third variable that's correlated with both of the variables is confounding or lurking variable. There is one time when causation can be determined, and that is if a true experiment is performed. An experiment is when the researcher assigns treatments to subjects and observes the reaction. If it's not an experiment, it's an observational study. So with the example of the cholesterol medicine, an experiment would be if we had a group of people who all had high cholesterol, and we randomly assigned some people to take cholesterol medicine, other people to take a placebo, and then at the end of a period of time, we determined who had more heart attacks. Now that would be a highly unethical study to do, but in that case we could determine cause and effect. All right, so again, like we said at the beginning, the best way not to be fooled by bad statistics is to have a healthy skepticism. Ask questions and don't take it at face value. All right, that's it for this lesson.